Hi everyone, thanks for joining. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Tori, you can hear me okay? Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. Um, my name is Rachel Millar and I'm going to be presenting one of the Ulster Wildlife Winter Talks tonight. It is Beyond the Shells, Restoring Oysters, Boosting Biodiversity. So basically talking all about Ulster Wildlife's native oyster restoration work. I am part of the marine team, and we also have Tori Moore, who is on board tonight as well, part of the marine team, and she will be helping read out questions at the end and things like that, and keep us on track with time. So this talk is all about native oysters, but I just thought I'd open with what is a native oyster. So when we talk about native oysters here, we're talking about oysters that are native to our shores, and that is the European flat oyster. Ostrea edulis is its Latin name. It is a bivalve mollusk, and when I say bivalve, I mean it has two halves to a shell. Um, so it has two shells. Sorry, I should say two shells connected together with a hinge. So in this picture here, this was one we were out doing a shore survey in Belfast Lough and we found this dead native oyster shell. And yes, this is um, the shell. You can see that it's got an upper and left valve, as it's also known in scientific terms, and also has the lower and the right valve. When we are talking about the valves of the native oyster, the top valve, the upper valve, is quite rounded. It's like a concave shape. It can be rough in texture, and yes, it looks a lot like quite thicker and rounded at the top, and then the lower part is more like a lid. It kind of looks like it kind of fits in just beneath that upper valve. So if we just pop on here, so this is the bottom, like the lid-like part of the shell, and this is more smoother and has like tiny, smaller ridges that are quite scale-like. Um, and you can see here then this is the upper part of one of the native oyster shells. This is quite an old one. This could be nearly 10 years old, this oyster shell. So it has a fossil-like appearance really, but it's quite rough and textured. Um, so yeah, when we are out normally doing our shore walks, native oysters are typically found in estuarine and coastal waters. You will find them in the likes of Strangford Lough, and at the moment we have found quite a few in Belfast Lough, quite solitary ones just around the shore. If I just show you this and it is an example from one of our shore walks. Um, I'll let you just focus your attention here and see if you can spot the native oyster in amongst all these shells. So they like to settle out where there is other hard substrate, whether that be, um, you know, rocky areas or typically they like to settle on other shells themselves. So have you spotted the native oyster shell yet? There you go. If you did, well done, because sometimes it takes a while to get your eye into them. Um, so
Sure, they
yes,
start starting together, do they?
so when we're talking about the native oyster, we are often people often ask us and talk to us about oysters that they would eat or they'd get in the restaurant. But we that would be the Pacific oyster, and the Pacific oyster is known, its Latin name is Chrysostrea gigas, and that is it there on the left-hand side. It's more of a teardrop shape. It's kind of got a little bit, in this picture it looks quite dark, but it's more like a purple coloring. It's quite a ruffled, textured, kind of crinkled shell. And it's quite a deep oyster. So typically when you see oysters served in a restaurant, they would be those deep cupped shells, and that would be the Pacific oyster. but we are more interested in the native oyster, which it can also be ate as well and is a commodity, but you most likely will get the Pacific oyster if you were out in restaurants. They brought in the Pacific oyster back in 1965, 1970s. It came from Asia. They brought it in to start up a commercial fishery, and they when they brought the Pacific oyster in, they didn't think it would be really that viable to spread beyond aquaculture facilities and trestles and whatnot, or that their larvae would go on from there, because they need very high water temperatures to spawn and for their larvae to go on. Um, so yeah, it's yeah. So when they did get those Pacific oysters in, south coast of England gets really, really high temperatures now, and we're seeing a lot more of the Pacific oysters as an invasive species coming across our shorelines in the south coast of England. And we have found some in Strangford Lough as well. So they are obviously being able to go out and do well in the wild, and it was first thought that they potentially wouldn't. So I've just show you just in comparison the two of them together. So that is the native oyster, as I showed you earlier, it's more rounded. So when you have the two of them together, you can kind of see the differences. But if you don't have them side by side, it can sometimes be difficult to identify the two. So if we just have a wee go back into the back in the day, and have a think about what oysters really meant to people and the cultural value. Well, oysters, have great historic significance in Northern Ireland. A lot of the members of our team have worked on a historic piece of work recently, and hopefully that work will be published soon. But some of the research that was carried out found that some of our earliest records were from Mesolithic times and Neolithic times, and these were sites that are called middens. So these are places where shells were discarded, and it was like their food waste areas. And these were unearthed in and around. There was places up near Glenarm, I think Strangford Lough as well. Um, and these archaeological digs are really important and show that oysters have been important for such a long time here. And yes, as we go through the years, you can see in the records, that this was the food of the common man, the working class people used to eat oysters all the time. It was kind of street food. And as time went on, as fisheries developed and as equipment improved, and as transport around Northern Ireland, transport between Ireland and the UK improved, you sort of seen this sort of change in the fishery development thing. More of the oysters were being harvested from beds here. And yes, all of our 5 sea lochs in Northern Ireland were oyster fisheries, and some of them were very prolific oyster fisheries as well. And here's just some images that show that their top one is just a man holding one of the old style dredgers. So this dredge, you know, it wouldn't have been the most sustainable sort of thing, but it would have been small. And then in the image, it shows you the men in the boat pulling in the dredge, and it was just by hand. The work was done by hand, so it would have been uh, sort of a sustainable harvest, I suppose you could say. And but as time went on, as things got more developed, they started harvesting more and more from the beds, and this overfishing basically caused the collapse of the fisheries that we have here in Ireland. They were all deemed collapsed by 1903. But we do have one still in action up in Lough Foyle. So Lough Foyle still has a small artisanal oyster fishery. that is managed by the Locks Agency, and that has been going for a very, very long time. Before the 1700s, I think that one's been going. And this map here, it shows us the orange shaded areas in and around the coastlines, highlight the areas where we had oyster beds, native oyster beds. So you can kind of see we're kind of squeezed into this map. We've nearly been cut off, but you can just see on the left-hand side there, Donaghadee and Strangford. And you can see on up there, just past Larne as well, there was some really, really big oyster beds there. They're probably a wee bit like more of subtidal oyster beds, but it's quite interesting to see that. And more locally then, this Belfast Lough map from the early 1900s shows the different oyster beds, public oyster fisheries. It shows mussel beds, cockle strands, and yeah, you'll see the oyster beds, the public oyster beds are in the pale pink. You'll see one out beyond Grimsport there, if you see it on the map. And yeah, it's quite interesting to see those. And yeah, if I just go back and have a wee talk about the different oyster fisheries that we actually had in action. So Larne Lough was active between 1800 and 1840. And this had about 30 boats working the oyster beds, and they were in the literature it says they were prized for their significant size and weight coming from Larne Lough. And then in Belfast Lough we had over 40 boats fishing for the oysters, and over 200 men were employed in Belfast Lough during its time. And Strangford Lough had around 50 boats fishing the lough as well. Carlingford Lough also had a commercial fishery since 1760. And yes, as I said before, all the fisheries were considered non-functional by 1903, which was probably just around the time of this map was produced. So where are we at now, really? So nowadays, we have lost 95% of our native oyster populations in the UK and Ireland since the mid-19th century. And globally, we have lost 85% of native oysters. So when we say native oysters, we mean native to shores. So these are all different oysters, but they're native to their shores here in this map. And you can see in and around Europe, which is our native oyster, the European flat oyster, the reef condition is basically poor or functionally extinct. So it just shows you the condition that, it's not doing well at all. 95% loss of our oysters here in the UK and Ireland, not good at all. And some of them actually say here functionally extinct, and that means that there is low numbers of them, and they're so small that the species does not affect the ecosystem around it, and it's very unlikely that they will recover. But there is a big effort at the minute all across Europe in bringing back the native oyster, Ostra edulis. This here map shows all the different oyster projects that are ongoing, whether that be active restoration or research into restoring the oysters. As you can see, there's lots going on in the UK. There is loads going on in France as well. So it's really exciting space to be in and to be working in. This here image actually comes from NORA, the Native Oyster Restoration Alliance. And they do really good work bringing together all researchers and scientists and groups working in native oysters. And then, like I said, lots going on in the UK, and we are on the map there now too. And some great stuff going on in Ireland as well. So basically, how all this started was back in 1903, obviously the fisheries were deemed collapsed, and They didn't think there was any native oysters still in Belfast Lough. They had done loads of research, surveys, everything into this species in and around Belfast Lough, trying to see what was happening. And it wasn't until before it was around 2020, a few solitary live native oysters were found around the shores of Belfast Lough, and this, you know, got everyone really excited. And one of our old colleagues, Dr. David Smith, actually went out and did a really good survey in and around Belfast Lough. And he found oysters in loads of different areas around the lough. And he basically produced this piece of work here, which sort of drove on this drive to get native oyster restoration underway in Northern Ireland, as places in England, as you've seen before, were already doing work. So it was great for us to get on board with that. And basically, that is how Ulster Wildlife came to get into the oyster restoration world. And how we are doing that is using oyster nurseries. So oyster nurseries are cage systems. As you can see in this image here, there's a couple of cages in there. The cages are held below pontoons, and they house hundreds of mature Austria-edgeless oysters. So we put in these mature oysters, and they're kind of kept there, and they're safe. They're a brood stock. They will produce larvae, and that larvae will hopefully go into the water column, hopefully make its way out to suitable habitat in suitable substrate, sorry, I should say, in Belfast Lough, or along the Antrim coast, where they will settle out and hopefully form oyster beds and reefs in numbers that we would want to see, used to see. So if I just play this wee video for you, so this is just a normal day out at Bangor Marina, just getting some of our oyster cages out of the water. So at Bangor Marina, we have a system which involves pulling up the cages from hatches below the pontoon. So this is us with our volunteers out on the pontoon. And as you can see, we have two cages here attached to a pole that goes across, and then we can lift the cages out of the water. And the cages actually have an inner section which holds the oysters separately so that we can tag them and we can keep track of their growth and monitor them for their growth, and also check the mortality of the oyster cages themselves. And then this is some footage from beneath the pontoon, which is really interesting. So this one is actually shot down in Glenarm. As you can see, they look more alive and everything, and all the fish coming around, inspecting and having a good nosy at the cages. So it's really cool to be able to put down the camera and see what's actually happening underneath. And as you can see, there's loads of particulate in the water here, but that's probably just from us pulling up and down the cages and knocking more stuff into the water off the cages. So I've already mentioned a few of them, but we have oyster nurseries in Bangor Marina. That was our first one. We put that in March 2022. 700 native oysters went in there, and at the minute, the majority of our oysters there are over 100 millimeters in length. And when we talk about the length, we're talking from the hinge to the top of the shell. So they're doing really well there. They're actually probably getting a bit too big for their cage. So we're looking at the next stage for that one. Oh, sorry. And Glenarm Marina, we have 800 oysters in Glenarm Marina, and we put that in March 2023, and we have 24 cages in there. And yeah, they're doing great. Glenarm's been really successful. There's not as much growth on the cages, and yeah, it's all doing really well there. And then our most recent native oyster nursery went into Belfast Harbour, and we have 600 oysters in there, and we went in, or we did that work in October 2023, and we have um, quite a few cages in there of different styles. Actually, we have some of the longer ones that you've seen in the video, and then a different style that would be used in aquaculture. So we're trialing that out there, and it's all been really successful too. So you're probably wondering why, why do we want to actually restore oysters? Like, why are they so important? And why do we need to care about them? Why do we need to do this work? So oysters themselves are ecosystem engineers, so they can alter the environment around them. Ecosystem engineers are they provide the ecosystem services, such as this is really good infographic here, and it tells you all why the oyster is important, but some of the main points are that it increases water clarity. So it takes in all that particulate out of the water, nutrients out of the water, and makes the water clearer. And this benefits other species such as seagrass, and kelps and seaweeds that rely on light coming through the water, so they can photosynthesize and they can grow as well. So it provides that connectivity between habitats as well. It's really good for that. So when you have increased oyster populations and when you build those beds up, the more spawning, the more larvae that's going into the water column, the more oysters you're going to get. So this can create a spillover effect into local fisheries as well. And as we've already spoke about earlier, the cultural value that comes with the oyster is really important as well in coastal communities. Also, as well as improving water clarity, they also improve water quality. So a native oyster can filter around 200 liters of water. That's probably like a mature adult oyster, which would probably be more than 80 millimeters in length, would be considered a mature native oyster, and they would take in 200 liters. They can filter it over their gill-like structures, and it removes pollutants and everything from the water column, and so it does improve water quality. And they are known, actually, they can take in plastics. When they take in the plastics, they can cover it in a mucus and deposit on the seabed and bury it away. I know they're not exactly removing it from the water exactly, or the system, but they take it in and they can store it away. They're also great for stabilizing sediments. So they lock down the sediment on the seafloor, and that can help even with climate change, with the increase of storms coming in. It's really important to protect our coastlines from storm damage and storm erosion. And also excess nutrients in the water, they can take that in out of the water as well. They are biodiversity enhancers. So these reefs create like nooks and crannies that loads of different organisms can live in. Although not the same with our artificial style cage systems, we have been seeing great biodiversity in and around our marinas and on the cages. And yeah, if we just go through this here, we've identified over 100 species so far in and around our oyster cages. And this here top image, if we go to the top row, we have a velvet swimmer crab, and then in the middle on the palm of the hand we have a glass eel. I'll talk about that later. We also have a corkwing wrasse as well there. You can kind of see lovely colors, looks very tropical. And we also have in the middle at the bottom there, we have a green sea urchin. And then we also have to the right of that a sea slug. So I'm just going to jump in and talk to you a bit about sea slugs. So also nudibranchs, technically. The term is nudibranchs, but they are commonly known as, or referred to as sea slugs. So these are soft-bodied marine gastropod mollusks. And they usually, when you think of sea slugs, you think of all tropical waters, lovely fancy colors, really like cool frills and designs. And they gain those colors by eating when they eat other animal or other organisms and other algae, they can take the pigment out of that, and that produces the color on them. We actually have more than 100 species here in UK seas, and at the minute we have identified 14 species on our oyster cages, and we have probably counted up to 100 nudibranchs themselves, which is really exciting. So, like I said, they eat algae, they can eat sponges, anemones, barnacles, and even other nudibranchs as well. Most of them live for a few weeks, and some of them can live up to a year. So these are some of the nudibranchs that we have actually found down at our nursery. I'm not going to try and name them by their Latin names. I'll just go with their common names, but that there is the humped or the Atlantic ancula, and it eats bryozoans. When it's mature, it can eat tunicates and sea squirts. That might actually be that might be the crowned Aeolus one, but yeah, they're really really exciting and interesting to find, and everyone's always really keen to find them when they're down. I haven't unfortunately found one myself yet, but you need a real keen eye for them. And if we just jump on, we have got a dusky doris here. And dusky doris, you can barely see it. I had to put a wee circle around it. So that's it on one of our oyster shells, and they actually feed on acorn barnacles. So that's probably what it's doing in this picture. The other cool one we have to the right here is a solar-powered sea slug. So this here actually absorbs chlorophyll from the algae that it's eating, and they use this to photosynthesize. You can kind of see it's got little kind of bluey green dots all over its body. But yeah, that's a really cool one. And onto the European eel. So this is something that we're super excited to find in our cages when we do, because this is a critically endangered IUCN listed species. It's also a priority species here in Northern Ireland alongside the native oyster. So it's great when we find them. So Lough Neagh actually has an eel fishery. It's the largest commercial wild eel fishery in Europe. So it's really interesting that we are, capturing some of these. Obviously, it's critically endangered. And yeah, so if I just tell you a wee bit about, so the glass eel, you can see it there in the palm of the hand. It is translucent, basically. And this is a very early stage in the life of the European eel. I should say these are both stages in its life cycle. So the glass eel is the one that comes after the larvae stage. So it's still very, very young. And yes, it's very dainty and they're lovely. We found one of those we found quite a few now, but found that one there in Belfast Harbour at our nursery there. And then if we go on to the next one, we have an elver eel. So we have found maybe about 2 or 3 of these down at Bangor Marina. So the elver eel is the stage that comes after the glass eel, and it's more developed at that point, and it has got more pigmentation. As you can see, obviously it's a darker and it's more like a golden brown. So yeah, if I just show you a wee bit about their life cycle, really. So silver eels travel back to their spawning breeding grounds in the Sargasso Sea, which is in the north of the Caribbean. The larvae that is produced in the Sargasso Sea then floats across in transatlantic currents to northeastern Atlantic coast, basically where we are, and then that's where they grow into glass eels. So that's why we're probably finding them in Belfast Harbour. So they'd be coming in through Belfast, up the like along the North Channel, Irish Sea, coming in to Belfast Lough, and then making their way up to go into fresh water up the River Lagan. So that's really cool that we've got to see that part of their life cycle, their journey. And then so they make their way into the River Lagan, and then they can, these are found in rivers and lakes as well, and obviously I was talking about Loch Ness as well, so they make their way to the lochs, so they're in fresh water, and then once they've got to their silver eel stage, they make their way back out again into the estuaries, and then back out into the seawater again, and make that journey back to the Sargasso Sea. So I think that's a really interesting life cycle, really interesting journey of them. And it's great that we can capture some of those stages in our native oyster nurseries. So I'm just going to play a wee video next. It's just one that we got produced for Glenarm. Hopefully you can hear it all okay.
Rachel, there's no sound coming through.
Oh, I'll try again. Thanks, Tori.
No worries.
Oh, it might not work. Let me see. Can you hear that now?
Sound isn't coming through. No, Sheila can't hear it either.
Well, that's okay. Well, we'll just play it.
It's got captions anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, so this was a short video that we got made just to highlight some of the work that we were doing. And that was mainly around Glenarm's native oyster nursery as well. Yep. So basically none of this would go ahead if we didn't have funding and project partners. So we are funded by DERA, and they are supporting us with an environment fund over the next 5 years to allow the expansion of the native oyster nurseries, to create a network across our waters. And we are hopefully going to be installing our next native oyster nursery at Carrick Fergus Marina in the next coming months. So keep an eye out for that as well. And yeah, we'd just like to thank the support we get from all the different marinas that are involved, Mid and East Antrim Borough Council that run Glenarm Marina, and Bangor Marina is run by boat folk. We're also Belfast Harbour funded their own nursery, and it's been great working with them as well on developing that. And we're also supported as well with a local company, Wilson Resources. So it's great to have people on board. But none of this would happen without all the hard work that we have from our volunteers. We really appreciate all the hard work that everyone puts in. We go down basically every week to one of our native oyster nurseries and take a group of volunteers down, and we maintain the cages, we check for mortalities in the oysters, we monitor the morphometrics, so we measure their growth, their length, width, weight, you name it, we'll measure it. And yeah, so it's really great to get people down and get hands-on experience in doing this kind of work, and recording how the project is progressing as well. So thanks for listening, everyone. And if you have any questions, which I'm sure you do, I'll answer them now for you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Rachel. There are a few questions in the chat, so I'll just go through them here. But if anybody has any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll go through them. I'll just go through them one by one here. First question that was put into the chat, Rachel, was from Ruth. I'm not sure if you can answer this one, but they're talking about are modern boat treatments more eco-friendly, i.e. paints, etc.
I'm not sure. I might need more detail on that one. Do you
Yeah.
mean, is it anything to do with, the paints on the boat, damaging the biodiversity? I'm not sure. Not sure
Yes,
about that one.
yes. It
Yeah,
would be paints and treatments to clean boat hulls
yes.
and so on.
Yeah, so I know that there was some work carried out by students and researchers at Queen's. They were looking at different techniques for removing biofouling. We do get a lot of what what people call biofoiling on our cages. We like to call it biodiversity as well, though. We get loads of different algae and sea squirts and everything like that people would get on the hulls of their boat as well. But yeah, we have actually been trying out some copper tape. Just a little tiny bit of copper tape seems to go a long way. But I'm not sure what the eco-friendly stance is on that really. And yeah, we just want to maintain the biofouling on our cages just because the larvae needs to get out of the cages and the water needs to flow through for the oysters. So yeah.
Oh, that's great. So thank you so much for that question. We've got another question here from Richard Buchanan. Do the growing number of local otters eat oysters?
I'm not sure about that one, Richard. I know that we have actually had some mysterious looking damage done to cages that look like something has tried to get into our cages. And yeah, I was always wondered what it was that had tried to sort of pry. It looked like it'd been prized apart. But no oysters were ever taken, so it's hard to know if that was maybe an oyster coming by. I'm not exactly sure where if there's, I think there might be otters down near Bangor Marina potentially, and that was where we had it, but I wouldn't be 100% sure on otter locations. Yeah.
I can imagine it's probably one of the things that they can and would
Yeah.
eat if they were
Yeah,
given the
yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah.
opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's great. We've got one about nudibranchs here. So Patrick Tiger, um, he's asked, the oyster team seems to find a lot of nudibranchs and other interesting species in the nurseries, far more than I ever find in rock pools. Why might this be?
Yes, Patrick, we do find a lot of species, but I also think it's having a Rebecca on your team. So we have a brilliant, I'm going to call her a taxonomist. So Rebecca is fantastic at finding species and IDing them. And yeah, I still haven't found any nudibranchs myself at all. And I think she's probably found all of them so far because really when you bring them out of the water, they just look like we scrunched up, I suppose little, like they don't look as colorful. They don't look like a nudie. They look like they're all just curled up. So that's maybe why at rock pools, yeah, maybe we need to get out diving more. You might be able to see things better then. But yeah, I think it's just maybe the more people that are looking at it. And we do try and keep track of the biodiversity. That's one of the things we look at when we're down at the oysters, and get people to, you know, if they find anything interesting, we try and make a note of all of that. So maybe just more eyes looking at them as well can find things.
Do you think they're more, I'm thinking like nudibranchs might not be that well adapted to rock pool environments either, Patrick.
Yeah,
I thought that maybe they're more like a lower, like low tide kind of species.
yeah.
Maybe that's why you don't see them.
I think Rebecca has found a few on some shore walks, but I do think they're just quite difficult
Yeah.
to spot. Yeah.
No, that's great.
But we'll get you out, Patrick. We'll get you out to find some.
So we've got another one, more of a technical question,
Yeah.
from David. What does resuspension mean?
So it means basically like when when we were talking about resuspension and that in that little infographic, it's basically when, I suppose, when you kick up any of the substrate or the mud or the sand, and it like puffs out into the water column, and it's resuspended into the water again. Whereas if you have oysters and things, it's kind of like covering that substrate, it's covering the mud, the sand, well, more like mud, and that kind of shelly substrate, and it stops more of that kind of resuspended substrate into the water.
Great. Sheila got a question here. So what is going to safeguard these oysters when they are released to prevent people from fishing them, etc.? And will you still be able to monitor them once they're released?
Yeah, so I actually didn't get a chance to discuss what our next stages are, but yeah, so we would like to put the oysters that are in the cages hopefully onto the seabed as a seabed deployment. That is what the projects are doing across the UK or across UK and Europe. And we would like to do that as well, but we need to pick locations that are going to keep the oysters safe, either from people hand gathering them or from boats dredging them. Basically, we need to pick that safe zone, that kind of nice area in between where people can't get at them and boats can't get at them. Hand gathering is an issue in Strangford Lough in particular, with a lot of different shellfish. And it is something that's been raised and is an ongoing thing with the Department of Agriculture and Environment. So DERA are well aware of that, and they are looking into hand gathering and how that can be addressed. And monitoring wise, yeah, we could still monitor them when we put them out. We could monitor them potentially, depending how deep they are, using the ROV, divers, that sort of thing.
Great. So Patrick had another question here. Quite a contentious issue,
Oh,
Patrick,
yes.
but see if we can answer it. Improvement in water quality is considered good when done by oysters, but bad when done by zebra mussels. Might it be the zebra mussels are scape mollusks, unfairly blamed for algal blooms in Loch Ness when bad land management is the main culprit?
Yes, so with this one, I think the issue is zebra mussels are invasive, and they are also the amount of them that is in Loch Ness is like such a huge amount that it's like over filtering the water, if you know what I mean. It's like the water quality is, yeah, I suppose that is, well, that's my take on it. I'm not 100% sure. I haven't looked into Loch Ness that much. It's fresh water. I stick to the marine only, Patrick.
I think you're right in that respect, that it has like it's just changed the habitat so
Yeah.
much. Like it's gone from a murky pea soup of Loch Ness to really quite clear water now. And that's what the big issue with it is. It's just a massive change in the loch. And so that's why the fingers being pointed at things like zebra mussels, because that's the big change that the loch has seen. But no, that's great. We've got M Dodds had just
Oh,
made a comment there about that there used to be a population of yellow eels in the
oh,
Bangor area
okay.
over 40 years ago.
That's
So
really
that's really
interesting.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. Thanks for letting us know. Yeah, it's really interesting that we get that Elver stage in Bangor Marina. Um, it must be it must be due to the waters being maybe slightly brackish there. I'm not sure, but yeah. But that's really good to know. Yes, Sheila,
Um,
we would like you to sing background music.
yeah, just go through here. So yeah, Ruth, you had another question there. So the setup in Dundrum Bay, is that mussels only, or do they grow oysters as well?
So Dundrum Bay, they grow Pacific oysters. I'm not 100% sure that they're growing any native oysters yet. Like I said at the start, they are a commercial commodity species. So native oysters could be, farmed here if people wanted to. But yeah, Dundrum Bay has Pacific oysters definitely, and probably mussels as well, grown there. Yeah.
Great. And then David asked, why can't Pacific and native oysters coexist?
Yeah, so Pacific oysters, obviously, like I said, when they were brought in over here, they didn't think that they would actually do well in our waters due to them being from like a warmer climate, and needing that warmer water temperature to be able to spawn. But they have covered the coast, the south coast of England. Our wildlife trust, um, trying to think which one it is now that Kent Wildlife Trust have had not real issues with Pacific oysters, but they have noticed that the Pacific oysters they've kind of covered a lot of the coastal area. They're kind of taken over that area, and it's not that they can't coexist. I suppose Pacific oysters might just, because they're kind of going through this boom because they're doing really well in our waters, and they're probably filling a void that the natives aren't there at the minute. Because natives are slower growers, they're more sensitive to environmental changes than the Pacific oysters. So the Pacifics have kind of covered a lot of the coastline, and they're kind of taking up a lot of space. And I know that they have started a group down in the south coast of England, and they call them coast busters, and they go and they remove Pacific oysters from the coastline in and around there.
Okay, great. We just had an extra question there from M Dodds asking, presumably the Strangford oysters served in
Mhm.
places like the Crown Bar are native oysters, not Pacific. No, I don't eat them myself.
Yes, so I have recently heard reports about a lot of these restaurants and places in Belfast selling a lot of native oysters from Strangford Lough, etc. So it's interesting. Yeah, they are natives, they're not Pacifics. Yeah. So, but they also, obviously, we do have the native oyster fishery still active up in Lough Foyle. So they could come from Lough Foyle, but obviously if they're saying Strangford oysters, they potentially are Strangford oysters. But yeah, it's interesting. I
Interesting to
don't
know
know
where
how
they're coming from.
yeah,
Yeah,
I don't know how
yeah.
they're getting them or yeah.
Interesting. Patrick had another question there. So, might commercial growing of natives be helpful to their population?
Yes, yes, I agree, Patrick. It's very similar to what we do with our native oyster cages, like we're holding like a broodstock, and hoping that they spawn and that their larvae goes out into the water column and boosts whatever populations we have. So yeah, I do agree that growing them commercially may be helpful to the actual wild populations as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, we've got a few minutes left, so if anybody has any other burning questions, I'll give you a couple of minutes just to type it in. But thanks very much, Rachel.